This is a production of Cornell University.
Today we have our guest, Mr. Negi, the evaluations officer from GEF and World Bank. Mr. Negi was born and brought up in a small town called Haldwan in northern India. He has over 10 years of experience in international development, ranging from grassroots level to multilateral organizations. He has a wealth of experience working on nature resource management, community organizations, and program and policy evaluation related issues. He currently works as an evaluation officer at the World Bank. Mr. Negi is also trained as a vocalist in India classical music and has been a track and field athlete. He started his career in 1998 with Seva Media, an NGO working on rural livelihood concerns of the tribal population in western India. He was involved in planning and implementation of projects on community forestry, watershed development, pasture land development, and agriculture extension. He was also associated with the Poverty Action Lab in MIT during 2002 to 2003. He coordinated a survey aimed at evaluating the healthy care delivery and healthy status of the people in rural India. Since 2005, he has been working as the evaluation office of the Global Environment Facility, GEF, and has been involved in many evaluations, including those on the GEF Small Grants Program, incremental cost assessment, and the resource allocation framework. He also coordinated the preparation and publication of the annual performance report of the GEF. Mr. Negi has an MBA from the Indian Institute of Forest Management and an MPA with concentration in economics from the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, Princeton University. Now, please join me to welcome our guest, Mr. Negi.
There are some flyers about employment opportunities at the World Bank. You can all pick up one. And you can also ask specific questions. He's ready to answer about how to get into multilateral organizations or World Bank in specific.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for the nice introduction, Inuvo. The politics of resource allocation, lessons from the GF experience. While this subject has interested me for long, it was only recently that I got an opportunity to learn about it in detail. I was a member of an evaluation team that reviewed the performance of this framework in GEF. In this presentation, I will cover macro development issues or macro developments that contributed to adoption of the new resource allocation framework by the GEF, and the micro events that led to RAF's present form. The GEF was established in 1991, and it was established to address global environmental concerns that had a transboundary or externalities element to it. It may fully or partially support incremental costs of achieving such benefits through grants or concessional funding. It has 178 members, and total cumulative grants that it has made so far are about $8 billion. It works on 6 focal areas, out of which biodiversity and climate change are the major ones because they account for 2/3, 1/3 each of the total programming resources of the GEF. To participate, a country must be a member of United Nations or its specialized agencies. The funding for GEF comes from donor countries through a process of replenishment, which is a 4-year cycle. This process involves negotiation on policy reforms and also conditions that would be applied for the next 4-year period. To be eligible for GEF funds, a member country must be eligible for borrowing from the World Bank, or it should be an eligible recipient of UNDP technical assistance. In addition to that, to receive funding on any specific focal area related project, it should also be a signatory to the relevant convention. This slide pictorially presents the GF partnership arrangement. You have the key decision makers in the center. You have the assembly, which is the body that comprises all the members of the GF partnership. And then you have council that takes day-to-day policy decisions and meets every 6 months. It has representation through the constituencies of the assemblies. You have CEO, which also doubles as the chair of the council, and then GF secretariat. And then you have the donor replenishment group, which works with this whole constellation of entities. And then you have evaluation office, which is independent from the secretariat. Then you have scientific and technological advisory panel that gives advice on scientific matters. You have NGOs that are not exactly part of the formal structure, but are there as a lobby group. Then to the left, you have conventions that provide guidance to the GEF. And to the right, you have implementing and executing agencies that implement the GF projects. Now, as some of you may know, that GF doesn't have a bureaucracy of its own. It's just a funding mechanism, and it implements its projects through the recognized implementing agencies, which in turn execute them with the local national partners. Let us now shift our attention to the allocation of resources by multilateral institutions. In the good old days, multilateral institutions generally allocated resources on a first-come, first-served basis. If they felt a submitted project was technically sound, if it was ahead in the queue, and if the resources were available, the proposal was accepted. This approach to funding had its pitfall. It was considered to be opaque, and it was felt that it was not incentivizing better performance by the recipient countries. The resource allocation framework aims at addressing these problems. Now, these are basically two types of criteria that resource allocation frameworks use. They're basically a formula. One is needs, which is primarily very stable. For some formulas, you can have size of the population, the GDP, and then performance, which is fairly sensitive and which changes based on what changes have taken place in the performance of a country. So the first, which is needs, determines how much an allocation a country might potentially receive. And the performance determines what the changes in those allocations are going to be based on the performance of the country. Now, one thing that should be noted is that allocation of concessionary funding or grants is a key element that runs through these allocation frameworks. You don't apply it for loans that are given on a market rate, which World Bank does in some situations. And then there are two primary types of formulas. You have additive and multiplicative formulas. Then you have indexes, and then you have exponents, and you can play around with them based on the preferences of the designers of these frameworks. Let us now turn our attention to what was happening in the macro environment. Among the multilateral arrangements, International Development Association adopted a resource allocation framework in 1977. And thereafter, it was adopted by other multilateral arrangements. What else was happening during this time? You had Monterrey Consensus in 2002, where countries asked for coherence and consistency in international aid for support of development. And then you had President Bush calling for linking greater aid to political, legal, and economic reforms. In 2005, you had Paris Declaration, where more than 100 countries committed to increasing efforts of harmonization and alignment of managing aids for results with a set of monitorable actions and indicators. All through this, you also find that within these multilateral institutions, there was increasing emphasis on results-based management. So it was not surprising that in 2006, GEF also adopted a resource allocation framework. In fact, you may see, based on the fact that others had already adopted it, GEF could be considered a laggard. Now let's shift to origins of GEF resource allocation framework. What were the micro events that led to its adoption within the GEF? Negotiations for the third replenishment began in 2000. After 2 years of negotiation, it's a very long process. 5 rounds had already taken place, and people were pretty much sure what the broad contours of the agreement would be. And surprisingly, you have US introducing a new condition during the last round. It made it additional contribution of $70 million contingent on progress on GEF adopting a new resource allocation framework. The new condition to establish a framework for allocation based on global environmental priorities and country-level performance. The implementation was to start in May 2003. Now, other member countries were pretty upset about it. Like suddenly you come up with a new condition and hold the other donors to ransom, and you try to push your agenda through. So it was pretty upsetting. But then if you look at these conditions, they're pretty broad, and everyone can read whatever they want to read in these. So it was accepted, and more or less at that time, no one was willing to move to another rounds of negotiations. So in August 2002, the third replenishment was completed, and these conditions were met, were accepted. Although it was accepted, as I mentioned earlier, only a period of less than a year was given to the GEF Secretariat to develop new proposals of how, what this framework would be like and how it should be implemented. So it was a short period of time. GEF Secretariat did come up with 2 proposals, which were ex ante allocation to the countries, which meant, well, you have countries, you have formulas, and then you allocate resources beforehand, before the start of the 4-year cycle. Every country knows how much resources it has. And the ex ante and the screening approach, which was more like you classify countries into different groups. Some countries have been traditionally performing well, some have not been performing well. So you treat them differently. If projects come from different countries, some have to go through a greater deal of due diligence and had a lesser probability of being approved than the lot that comes from the other countries. But it was still in a rudimentary phase. So at this stage, there was a lot of discussion within the GEF partnership. Why change? I mean, after all, the existing framework or the existing system of allocating resources was working pretty fine for GEF. So why do you need to change it? Why do you need to tinker around with it? Then the issue of uniqueness of GEF mandate. It's the only institution in the world that's created to address the global environmental concern, to address the transboundary issues, to address the externalities for which national governments don't have an incentive to address. Then the issue of complexity of GEF. GEF is a bureaucracy over highly complicated bureaucracies like World Bank, UNDP, UNEP, and you're trying to add another layer of complexity to this system. Then the issue of transaction costs. If you look at this table, you find, well, GEF is working in the most number of countries, but it has a very low per country allocation. So that means, in terms of transaction costs, a lot of things need to be done, and whether it's like worth it to introduce a new complexity which would lead to increased transaction costs. To facilitate development of a resource allocation framework, a working group was constituted. It was felt that, well, Secretariat is not coming up with suitable options. We should have a working group. And in July 2003, this working group starts functioning. So now it's interesting to note how this working group was constituted. 10 members were appointed by the respective constituencies in the GF Council. Now you had a technical group that is constituted by nomination by the political entities. And then there were 2 members that were the experts that had been put in by the Secretariat. So you had a lopsided type of group that was highly political in nature. It had insiders from various constituencies which were participating in the discussions, but then relaying it back to their respective constituencies. The options that this group was coming out with were not acceptable or were not consistent with what with the kind of formulation that US wanted. So US outrightly rejected whatever it was proposing. And just before the next council meeting, US council members sent a letter to other council members saying that the discussions are going off track. Whatever they are coming out with is not acceptable. The only option that's acceptable to it is an ex-ante country allocation system. The group was subsequently abandoned because of that, and GF Secretariat has to take over the responsibilities again. To understand some of the backdoor political maneuvering, there were a lot of political maneuvering by actors that are not expected to vote in the council meetings going on. So to understand that, I would briefly touch upon how it works at a recipient country level. An implementing agency like World Bank, UNDP, or UNEP prepares a project in consultation with the national partners, and then it seeks endorsement of the recipient government, and then it submits it to GF Secretariat for approval, and then it comes to the council, and council approves it. The linkages between, the interaction between implementing agency and the GF Secretariat are pretty dense, and between implementing agency and the recipient government are pretty kind of weak. From the recipient country perspective, or from the implementing agency perspective, flexibility in choice of activities. They can choose whatever they want to do within the GF constraints. And then geographical focus, and then timing. I mean, these are things they can easily dictate. From the recipient country perspective, macro level uncertainty about how much resources they would eventually get. But then GF is a maze, it's a labyrinth, and it's very difficult to navigate it. And the implementing agencies were helping them navigate that system. And above all, it was grant money. The countries were not required to pay it back. So basically, it was free money for them, which was coming through the implementing agencies, and they liked the system in that sense. NGO's perspective, well, it has problems, but we can live with it. Now, the proposed system, what it does to this dynamics, it's very interesting to note. What it does is, it makes the interactions between the recipient government and the implementing agencies strong, and it weakens the position of the civil society and private sector within the GF arrangement. Now, how this happens, recipient countries now know how much resources they have, and they feel ownership of it. They know beforehand, next 4 years, they are going to get this much money, and they can program based on it. So they have greater choice in preferring one agency over the other and the type of activities they want to focus on. But then there are issues. One of them is the smaller countries would lose chance of having bigger projects sanctioned, because smaller countries would have very small allocations and they don't have an incentive, something of a lottery type of incentive. You don't have a chance to win big. And also, at this stage, they were not sure how much their own individual allocations would be. So while some small countries were sure that it was very small, but the others were not very sure how much they would get out of it. From the implementing agency perspective, this was a disaster. They have to compete among themselves. They have less flexibility in terms of what they can do in a country, because now the government is the master, and they have to establish linkages with the new department. New departments that are now required to endorse the proposals. From NGO perspective, you find a split. International NGOs that are working on biodiversity are pretty happy with the arrangement. They're like, well, we like it, because it's concentrating money, it's based on global environmental benefits, it's concentrating money in areas where you have global biodiversity spots, and then they were happy about it because it was now happening in a very transparent manner, and they were assured that this much money would go to these areas. But they were not ready to speak out loud about it, because at that time the political climate was such that you didn't want to be identified as supporting the US policies. So they were quiet about it. The national NGOs that had an opportunity to participate in the GF projects as executing partners felt that the new arrangement would make the national government stronger, because they now have more say in who would get to execute the projects, and they are systematically biased against the NGOs. What you see is a situation where all these actors are there, they have their interests, but no one is speaking out loud in favor of the new system, and everyone kind of supports the old system. There were new developments that were taking place. Country needs were defined in the next council meeting. Biodiversity and climate change were agreed upon as focal areas where RAF would be applied. Proposals on different indicators and allocation formulas were presented. A new concept of ex-ante group allocation was also proposed. Now, there were a lot of hectic parleys going on, and GF Secretariat was working very closely with the US representative, and those who have visited Global Environment Facility or World Bank for that matter know that World Bank and US Department of Treasury, where the member is from, are basically 2 blocks from each other. So you can basically walk every day and talk about, what are the new developments in the allocation framework design. And then they were in touch with other donors through telephonic conversations. So a lot of it was happening in consultation, and people were trying to come up with proposals that would be accepted in the council meetings. In September 2004 council, 3 options: ex-ante country allocation and ex-ante group allocation, wherein countries are clubbed into a group, and the group has predetermined allocation, and countries can compete within that, was presented. And then you had rules-based screening, which was something that was taken up from the earlier proposals. So these were presented, and the member countries that were recipients were told that these formulas or these proposals are based on precedents, and therefore, on average, they won't be losing any money before compared to what they were getting earlier on. But US took a strong stance, and Canada was supporting it in that country allocations or nothing else. EU and Japan and G77 were totally on the other side. So you had a split. You had 2 countries on one side, and the remaining 178 divided 176 on the other side. So what happens now is a classical political solution, which is Canada proposes a hybrid model for facilitating consensus, which is like, well, allocate, have individual allocations for the countries that have bigger allocations, and then group allocation for the countries with small allocation. No agreement happens on that, but still it's there on the table. Now, the US has pretty much convinced everyone that, well, it's going to walk out if it doesn't get the moon. and the prospect of US withdrawal. What does it mean for others? Because people are assessing what are the pros and cons of a GEF without US. I mean, it's an arrangement which is based on burden sharing. US pulls out, then you have a situation where Japan would pull out and other countries would reduce their contributions. And then, as a result, GF system would collapse. So GF survival was at stake. And this led to reassessment of approaches by other actors in the system. What happened now was the World Bank president called a meeting of the big three, the UNDP, UNEP, and World Bank heads. They met and they finally agreed to support RAF. Earlier on, they had been reluctant, and then they tried to persuade other members through backdoor maneuvering to agree to it. In March 2005 discussion, the indicators and share of allocations were pretty much decided. There was some stalemate that was still continuing, which was over ceilings. And during this period, China and Brazil were pushing for the ceilings to be pushed up. And then in the end, after a lot of negotiations, a hybrid system was accepted. What you find here was that US, as a highly motivated actor, had succeeded in influencing others to accepting its terms. I'll briefly run through the design of RAF. You have country allocation, which is determined by biodiversity and climate change allocations. Then you have biodiversity allocations and climate change allocations, which have two components, which are multiplied, biodiversity index and the performance index. And then you may like to ask the question, why this exponent 1? Because you can do without it. And the reason is optics. It sends a message that performance is, since 1 is greater than 0.8, performance is more important in this. I'm running through the biodiversity index, which has two components, terrestrial biodiversity and marine biodiversity. Now you may ask a question, why 80-20? Well, Jeff Secretariat ran some simulations and then invited the biodiversity experts to give their opinion on them. And then what they felt was, I will repeat, what they felt was, according to their worldview, this seems to portray the world situation fairly accurately. So it was a judgment call there. Similarly, you have other elements in this indices, and the ratios were decided just by judgment. Now you may like to ask, there are other challenges that people face in developing such indices. Why only fish species? There are mollusks and there are other species that are equally important. Well, because data is available only for fishes. It's available for others, but it's very patchy. Then what about agrobiodiversity? Well, data on that is very, very patchy, and it can't be compared easily. So these are technical challenges that the teams were facing. Now you have climate change benefits index, which is based on baseline greenhouse gas emissions in 2000, and then the carbon intensity adjustment factor. What you don't find within this formula is adequate representation for the land use and land use change and forestry issues, LULUCF issues. So none of the LULUCF indicators were included in this. You may also ask why adaptation is missing from the whole mix. Like all these indicators, all the indicators that have been included are basically climate change mitigation indicators, not adaptation indicators. Well, for that, there was a political decision, which was basically the council took a position that adaptation is very difficult to distinguish in terms of what its global environmental benefits are, whether there is a transboundary element involved or not. Then you have the performance index, which is portfolio performance, 10%, and country policies and institutional assessments, 90%. The council, again, here took a position that, well, policy environment is what predicts the future performance better. And portfolio performance, while it tells about what they have done in past accurately, it may not be very useful in predicting what would happen in future. Now, these are totally judgment calls, and as a policymaker or a person who would probably be interested in working in such an area, it's important to note that such major decisions are just basically taken based on hunches. Determining allocations. I will just go through the concept. You have the allocations for each of these focal areas. You have 10% set aside. You have eligibility formula. And then you have the 75-15% split for individual allocations and for group allocations. Now you may ask a question, why 75, 15, and 10%? And the reason was, during the final stages of negotiations, when it was pretty much clear that a hybrid system would be adopted, US took a position that, well, we would be willing to accept a hybrid system if at least 50% of the resources are allocated through the resource allocation framework. And as I said before, biodiversity and climate change account for 2/3, so you can do the math. And because of all these arrangements, it was the global and regional programs, the small grants program, and the cross-cutting capacity building program that were receiving more of allocations earlier on that suffered a lot. In terms of how it is applied, this is how GPI combine. They give you a country score, and then you have the country allocations. These are notional country allocations. And then you have minimum, the floor applied and the ceilings applied. Without ceilings, the top climate change allocation would have been 224 million for China and 65 million for Brazil and biodiversity. What you see, the countries with a green color, the light green color, are the ones that would have incentives to improve their performance as far as design is concerned, because of the way resources are allocated. Only the countries at the just below, which have crossed the ceiling and which are below the floor, would have little incentive to improve their performance. Now, with the hybrid system, what happens is this. You have applied the cut. The top countries before over the line are individual allocation countries, and the remaining are the group allocation countries. The number of countries that have incentives to improve decreases dramatically. Only few countries in the group allocations actually have incentives to improve because their allocations are in a group. So even if they perform badly, they would be in the group next time also, and they can compete and get resources just based on the earlier mechanism. So you've ended up with a system, through political compromise, you've ended up with a system which is not exactly what a clean analysis of the design would have suggested. So at times, political compromises would lead you to suboptimal solutions. Did it increase replenishments? Well, in nominal terms, it did. It slightly increased from $3 billion to $3.14 billion. But in real terms, it actually declined. So I leave you with some questions. And the questions are, for the donors, was it worthwhile to make compromises for the sake of GF's survival? For US, to what extent RAF would allow it to meet its intended goals? More importantly, would this system allow GF to achieve its mandate? Another question you may like to ask, is it equitable? Then you have problems associated with a design that's based on precedent. The countries that were more resourceful earlier on, that had capacities, were developing good projects. And then you have used the same allocation, historical allocation, to come up with formulas that allocate now. So is it equitable in that sense? Is it cost efficient for such a small contribution that GF gets, whether applying such a framework makes sense. Or is it still worth the trouble because it has benefits in terms of harmonization with what other multilateral institutions arrangements are doing and alignment with the other priorities. As we have seen in this case study, politics greatly affects policy making, even in a small multilateral arrangement such as GEF. There are competing interests, and then there are limits in terms of kind of questions that could be answered through science and policy analysis. What should be the role of public policy professionals in these situations? Probably to remind decision makers, given the state of science and the tools available for policy analysis, what the best policy options are, and then letting politics take care of the trade-offs. With that, I end my presentations. Thanks for listening. Thanks. I'll be willing to take questions.
Hello, my name is Daniela, and I was just curious how you pose these questions to us. If you want after other questions or right now, I'd like to know your opinion on these questions.
Yeah, the idea is, means these are the questions with which you would struggle later on. And it's good to think about them. I mean, my idea is not for you to answer them in this meeting or in this gathering. These are the questions which I would like you to take from this presentation. I have my opinions, but then I'm also not totally free to express them because I'm still working in the same arrangement. So.
Is there questions? Okay.
Could you talk a bit more about how you create ownership in these programs that you mentioned? That I wasn't sure of how these grants work and how does the recipient country feel in ownership? You said they know they're going to get this much money, but it's free money.
Yeah.
So in the earlier system, what was happening was countries didn't know how much money they are going to get at the end of 4 years. Like, it's a pipeline. Projects are coming. Some projects get thrown out. Some are in animation, suspended animation, and some get funding. So there is an unpredictability element. So recipient countries on their own can't program what they want to do in the next 4 years with the GF resources because they have no clue what's available to them. Now, in this situation, they're implementing agencies that pretty much know what the big part of the GF resources is, and they're operating at a global level. So for them, it's more of a portfolio exercise. You throw in 100 projects, 50 get selected, 50 gets thrown out. Well, that's fine. It doesn't matter. So it makes countries have less stake because if the project gets accepted, they're happy about it because, well, they didn't have that many stakes. But once you tell the countries, well, this is the part that you have, and you can program based on your priorities, then you're telling them, oh, wait a minute. A country like China would know that it has $150 million now. So it can actually appoint 4 people to develop priorities and to take care of it and to think about where they actually want those resources to be used. So now they can dictate terms to the implementing agencies because when implementing agencies come with proposals, they would say, well, this doesn't suit our priorities, and we know this much money we have. We'll go to agencies that are preparing projects that take care of our interests. So in that sense, it creates ownership about the resource. Yeah.
In that same question, can you give us an example, like a study case, or that it's actually trying already to get these for a biodiversity protection, for example?
Pardon?
Like, give us an example of a particular case of a study, a city, a place that is going to go after this fund. There haven't been any. Have you any countries that are already active in it?
Yeah, these countries are active. Like, it has been under. See, the reason why I'm not discussing experiences, it has been under implementation, I mean, it was adopted, accepted, agreed upon in 2005, then it was formally adopted in 2006, then it was actually implemented in 2007, so it has been under implementation for only 1 year. And during this 1 year, people have been trying to come to terms with what the new rules are. So it's like very difficult to come up with a representative case that would explain the situation well. But the truth is, there's some countries which are very active, India, China, and they know how much the resources are, they have capacities, and they want to take charge of it, and they can dictate terms to the implementing agencies that, well, for this issue, we want this agency to work. Now, specific examples I may not be able to give because we look at this problem from a portfolio perspective and from a distance. So I don't know whether.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Jesse McCree. I'm a first-year student at SIPA. I was actually really interested in some of the last comments you made about the politics in decision-making in some of these large group settings. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about who the decision makers are in terms of these countries. Is there a spokesperson? You mentioned something about how the United States and some countries were on the opposing side. Who are those people that are the spokesperson in these entities? How are they making their decisions, and what are the underlying politics there?
So basically you have General Assembly, which has all the members represented. Then you have constituencies, and constituencies are split between the donor countries and the recipient countries. So you have 16 members from the donor countries and 16 members from the recipient countries. And these members generally are either from the Department of Treasury, as is the case in US, because they actually make contributions, and it comes from that department. And then for many constituencies, they could be people who are in the Environment Department or Forestry Department and Finance Department. So it depends on country to country. Primarily, most of them are, for the donors at least, are people who are from the Treasury Department. Now, even though you have halfway split, it's not, that's not how it really works. The politics there is more run by the big donors, which in this case is US, and also then you have other people who follow the lead of US. So US in these situations exercises way more influence than other countries compared to its share in the burden sharing arrangement. And the developing countries, often they don't have capacities. Often there are some developing country constituencies that are represented by the developed countries because they don't have resources to put in one person to attend the meetings. So it works in a ways that systematically favors either big recipient countries like India and China or the donor countries. Yeah.
My question is whether, when you said it's from a portfolio perspective, from a distance, when you work on this allocation, so does the World Bank, that little diagram you drew about recipient country, implementing agency, and something at the bottom, you had very little sectors for civil society and private sector.
Yeah.
So does the World Bank, or from your portfolio perspective, do you encourage the recipient aid country to work more with private sector or civil society to share the burden? Like when you even mentioned the NGO part of it, you just really glossed over it.
Yeah. First of all, like I should clarify, like GF is a funding mechanism which is hosted by the bank. It's a trust fund. So it's a separate entity in some sense. It's just hosted by the bank. We get recruited as part of the World Bank staff. For HR purposes, we are part of the bank, but as an institution, we are a separate entity altogether. We don't fit in the same chain of command. We actually give funding to the World Bank, which has more operational presence in the recipient countries, and also to UNDP, UNEP, and then there are other countries that get, other multilateral institutions that get funded through us. In terms of NGOs, in the formal structure, they are allowed to participate in the council meetings. They don't have a vote in the council meeting. They can intervene at the permission of the chairman of the council. And then in the real sense, they're not a major player at all because it's a multilateral institution and it recognizes countries as its members. So the ownership, the key ownership is with the countries. Now, earlier on, even though I had shown NGOs and private sector at the periphery in a small box, what I'd also shown, if I could go back there, I don't know. If I could go back there, I'd also tried to show that the linkages were way more stronger in the earlier formulation, and they got weakened in the later one. Because earlier on, it was the implementing agencies that were in the driving seat, and they chose their partners based on who the best would be for a given project. Now, if you have government at the driving seat, well, it brings in ownership of the resources, but it also brings a pitfall that, well, they have their own agencies that do similar work. Now you have governments, say, Department of Environment or Department of Forestry doing something. So what I've shown here is, I don't know, oops, sorry. Anyway, so is it showing there or do I have to show?
Go back. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. Go back.
Okay. Yeah, what I've shown is a stronger linkage here, and then it's a weaker one here. And it becomes weaker because now the government can decide who they actually want to work with. And it's a reality that NGOs are at the periphery. It's not politically wise to say it that way, but that's the way the system is set up. So, I mean, there's a specific program that addresses NGOs, which is through the small grants program. And there, for which I mentioned earlier, we have a 10% set aside. Out of that 10%, 5% goes to the small grants.
So this is successful for your donor funding. You prefer this setup?
No, I don't prefer any setup.
No, you personally.
Huh?
I don't mean you personally. I meant the
Yeah, but the thing is, after all these negotiations and all the politicking that took place, this was the framework that was agreed upon. And this is what exists.
This is, I don't know how you feel about answering this question. How does it feel to work in a bureaucracy like that? And does it get frustrating, just your experiences?
Well, it's a bureaucracy, and I won't say it doesn't get frustrating, but then you're also dealing with a lot of the important challenges that the world is facing. And think of the scale, like I'm talking about $3 billion of replenishment, and then I'm saying that, well, that's too small. And I used to work for an NGO which would get an allocation which would have total resources of probably $4 million for 4 years. So it's a question of scale, you know, whatever small decisions you're going to take are going to have a big impact, and therefore it's challenging in that sense. So I see my value in the evaluation office as doing evaluations wherein I use all the policy tools that I have at my disposal and trying to come up with, say, assessments which provide information to the council which lead to better decisions. They don't always happen, but that's what we attempt to do.
You just alluded to your previous experience in the NGO, and I just wondered if you could speak a little bit more about what experiences brought you to your current position.
Well, that's an interesting question. After I had worked with the NGO, of course, I did a lot of work on rural livelihoods, poverty alleviation, natural resources. And during that period, I felt I need to upgrade my skills, and that brought me to US, and where I studied at the Woodrow Wilson School. After graduating, of course, I thought I would try to work in a multilateral environment just to gain exposure to what was happening in these institutions. They were basically a black box to me when I saw it from down there from an NGO. And then you say after 1 year there was a sense of inertia. It was like, okay, things are working out. I'm figuring out how the system works, and I'm able to contribute. So I decided to stick with that. And that's, it was pretty much somewhat random in that sense. When I was at the NGO, I was not dreaming of being wherever I am, but that's where I ended up being.
What are some of the policies that you use to measure the country policies and institutional risk assessments? What are some of the policies? What are some of the indices that you use to measure? Okay, that are used to measure country policies when you are wanting to arrive to one of the indices?
Okay, yeah. Those the World Bank has a system. There are CEPA ratings that they come out with, which is used to. I've just forgotten its expanded form, which they use to allocate the IDA allocations. And from those 16 indicators that they have, there's a cluster of 5 that talks about the general policy environment, which are taken to constitute the 20% part of it. And there's one indicator within that which talks about the environment part of it. That's taken to have a weight of 70% because it deals with the environment. Now, one decision that the council took earlier on in the day was when they would use the indicators, they would go for indicators that are already there, that are being collected by other, say, credit-worthy institutions. And because one reason was, well, you don't want to collect your indicators because then information on your indicators because people would, say, ascribe motives to it. And then also, we didn't have resources to actually collect it on a systematic basis fairly quickly across the board for so many countries where we were working. There's one component in it there's some countries for which that information is not available from the World Bank indicators, and in that case, we use the IFAD indicators for the rural environment.
You've worked both at the grassroots implementation level and now at the policy level. So how would you compare your experiences, and could you link any of the applications of what you're currently doing to what is applicable in the field, reflecting on your grassroots experience?
Well, it's again an interesting question and difficult one at the same time. There's a lot of things are applicable, like now I work with the evaluation office. I'm able to design surveys better. Things like how to go about conducting a survey wherein you need responses from a diverse set of people. I also got some operational experience of, say, running a big evaluation for the Poverty Action Lab there. So those are the kind of experiences I find very, very useful in my present position. A lot of operational experience, which was about understanding community problems, it does advise me in certain, it does guide me in certain situations, but I don't find it very, very useful in the day-to-day work that I do, wherein more analytical tools that I've learned through schools and the context-based information I learned from just being in these multilateral institutions is probably more useful. So, but that's my own personal experience, which is based on working with the evaluation office rather than an operational unit, where I'm sure it would be a different ballgame altogether.
Is there any other questions?